While biases can be problematic, the psychologists who have long studied them would be hard-pressed to classify them as simple cognitive flaws. Instead, biases exist as rules of thumb or heuristics that evolve to make fast decisions in environments with limited information. An example of these heuristics is the idea that people may perceive groups using two dominant characteristics: warmth and competence. This model predicts that groups high in warmth and low in competence, such as disabled people, babies, and the elderly, elicit sympathy, whereas groups low in warmth and high in competence elicit envy or jealousy. Humans can have overgeneralized beliefs regarding members of a social group, what we know as stereotypes, and exhibit biased attitudes towards those groups. This is known as prejudice. Prejudice may then lead to unfair treatment or discrimination. But because heuristics work as a way to facilitate decision-making in environments with too little or too much information, it is not surprising that we find them in both humans and machines. Similar to humans, cognitive machines are inferential and base their inferences on abstract forms of categorization. In order to make predictions, machines often group and classify data using explicit and abstract features. Consider the idea of a principal component, a vector that accounts for most of the variance in a dataset. Principal components are a common tool in machine learning, and they are similar to the idea of a stereotype, like classifying people using the vectors of warmth and competence. Unlike warmth and competence, however, principal components usually involve abstract features that are derived directly from data and can be difficult to interpret. These dimensionality reduction techniques are computationally powerful, but they add obscurity to algorithms, pushing some people to advocate for increased transparency and interpretability as a way to mitigate algorithmic bias. In fact, the use of explicit versus abstract features has been at the core of a nuanced discussion on the bias and fairness of algorithms lately. To avoid biases based on gender or race, scholars have proposed a variety of methods, from simply removing explicit demographic characteristics from a dataset to predicting outcomes using only variables that are orthogonal to demographic characteristics. Yet, recent research has shown that methods that tend to circumvent the possibility of bias may actually backfire, because reaching fair outcomes is better served by using the most accurate predictors, even if these include explicit demographic information. In a recent paper on algorithmic fairness, John Kleinberg, Jens Ludwig, Sendil Mulanathan, and Ashish Rambachan developed this idea by comparing an efficient and an equitable planner. These planners were tasked with admitting college applicants. The efficient planner was interested only in maximizing performance, measured by the grade point average, GPA, of the students admitted to college, while the equitable planner was interested in both performance and the racial composition of the admitted class. To illustrate this idea, the scholars compared three methods: admissions that were blind to demographic variables, for instance by removing race from the data; admissions that included variables that were orthogonalized with respect to racial variables; and admissions that used racial variables explicitly. They report that the most equitable and efficient outcomes were reached using the model that explicitly included demographic variables. But how is this possible? To understand this distinction, consider students from two races: a race P of privileged students and a race U of underprivileged students. Both are applying to college. Because of their privileges, students in race P score higher in many of the variables that are predictive of future academic success, such as standardized test scores. Should we blind algorithms to race? Or is there a better solution? Imagine a student from race U that obtained the same score than a student from race P on a standardized test. The student from race U was able to reach the same outcome as the student from race P in the absence of P's privileges. Yet, a model lacking an explicit racial variable will be unable to adjust for the lack of privilege affecting the scores of students from race U. A model that is blind to race will rate both students equally and hence hurt the less privileged student. Instead, what the proposed theory suggests is to use the most accurate possible model, including racial variables when relevant, and then setting different thresholds to achieve the desired level of equity, using, for instance, some of the definitions of fairness introduced earlier in this chapter. This example illustrates the importance of separating the goals of equity and predictive accuracy. Even though it may be tempting to modify data to eliminate any trace of demographic characteristics, the best way to achieve efficient and equitable outcomes may be to treat prediction and equity as two separate parts of the same problem. In the US, discriminatory treatment is not only frowned upon, but also illegal. Title VII of the 1963 Civil Rights Act is a federal law that prohibits employers from discriminating against employees on the basis of sex, race, color, national origin, and religion. The Supreme Court affirmed Title VII unanimously in 1971 in Griggs versus Duke Power Company, a class action suit claiming that Duke's policies discriminated against African American employees. The court ruled that, independent of intent, discriminatory outcomes for protected classes violated Title VII. In our data, we find important differences in the level of intent and responsibility assigned to discriminatory actions performed by humans and machines. However, in agreement with the Griggs decision, we find only small differences in moral judgment, suggesting that, in unfair cases, it is the outcome rather than the intention that it is judged. The removal of intent from the legal judgment of bias has important implications for those working on the fairness of algorithms. It means that even in the absence of intent, those creating the algorithms may be liable for biased outcomes. This outcome-based approach to policing discrimination is opening a new market for an algorithm certification industry and discipline, a community focused on auditing the bias of algorithms and certifying them when they are not biased. In the next chapter, we shift our gaze away from algorithmic bias and focus on another uncomfortable aspect of our digital reality: privacy. This will help us expand our understanding to another dimension of the way in which humans judge machines.